You're listening to this right now. Maybe in bed, maybe with the lights off, maybe wearing headphones so the sound fills every corner of your skull. Good, because what I'm about to share with you tonight isn't fiction. These aren't made-up monsters or Hollywood jump scares. These are real events, real people, real suffering. The cases you're about to hear have been investigated by police, documented in court records, reported by journalists, and in some cases survived barely by people who are still alive today, still looking over their shoulders, still waking up in the middle of the night, unable to explain what they saw, what they felt, or what happened to them. My name doesn't matter. What matters is what you're about to hear. 10 stories, each one true, each one more disturbing than the last. Don't say I didn't warn you. Story 1. The house on LM Drive. Let's start with something that, on the surface, looks ordinary. A family moves into a new house. A nice house, actually. 4 bedrooms, a big backyard. A quiet street in a suburb outside Albuquerque, New Mexico. The kind of neighborhood where people wave at each other from their driveways and kids ride bikes until dark. The Ramirez family had been looking for a fresh start. David Ramirez, 38, worked in construction. His wife, Sandra, 34, was a school librarian. They had 2 daughters, Lily, who was 9, and Mara, who had just turned 6. By all accounts, they were a normal, loving family. They moved into the house on Elm Drive in April of 2003. Within a week, the calls started. Not threatening calls. Not the kind of thing you'd immediately report to the police. Just hang-ups. Sandra would answer, and there would be silence on the other end. Not the hollow silence of a dropped call. Something heavier than that. Breathing. Slow, steady breathing, and then a click. David told her it was probably telemarketers. Kids playing pranks. The neighbors said that the last family who lived there had moved away suddenly. But they didn't know why. The house had sat empty for almost 8 months before the Ramirezes arrived. The first strange thing Lily told her parents happened about 3 weeks after they moved in. She came downstairs one morning and told her mother that the man in the basement had been talking to her again last night. Sandra's blood went cold. They didn't have a basement. When Sandra pressed Lily, the girl pointed to a door in the back of the kitchen. A door Sandra had assumed led to a utility closet. She had never opened it. She opened it now and found stairs leading down into darkness. What they found at the bottom of those stairs would be the beginning of something none of them would ever fully recover from. The basement was unfinished. Bare concrete floors. Exposed pipes running across the ceiling. It smelled of mildew and something else. Something sweet and wrong. Like old flowers rotting in still water. There was no one down there. But there was a room. In the corner of the basement, someone had built a small room out of drywall. It wasn't on any of the house blueprints that the realtor had provided. It measured roughly 6 feet by 8 feet, and its door, a simple wooden door with a sliding bolt on the outside, was shut. David opened it. Inside, they found a mattress on the floor. Old, stained, a bucket in the corner. A length of chain bolted to the wall with a heavy iron ring at the end. And on the wall, scratched into the drywall with what appeared to be fingernails, were hundreds, maybe thousands, of small marks, tally marks. Someone had been keeping count. They called the police that same afternoon. Officers came, photographed the room, took samples of the stains on the mattress. They tried to trace the ownership of the house before the previous family. A couple named the Graysons had listed it for sale. What they found took months to unravel. The house had been owned before the Graysons by a man named Gerald Pruitt. Gerald had purchased the property in 1987, lived there alone for 15 years, and then, in 2002, had simply vanished. No forwarding address, no death certificate. No record of him crossing any border. He simply ceased to exist as far as official records were concerned. But the investigation didn't stop there. When forensic analysts processed the swabs from the basement room, they found DNA from multiple individuals. Not just one or two, multiple. The tally marks on the wall, when counted precisely, numbered 412. What exactly those marks represented, what was counted in that room over those 15 years, was never definitively established. But everyone involved had the same theory. Here is where the story becomes truly disturbing. 3 months into the investigation, police linked Gerald Pruitt's name to a cold case from 1991. A young woman named Teresa Hollis, who had disappeared while jogging near her home 15 miles from Elm Drive. She had never been found. Then another case. 1994. A teenage girl. Then 1997. A woman in her 20s. Pruitt was never caught. He was never officially charged. Because he was never found. But here is the part that has stayed with investigators for 20 years. 6 months after the Ramirez family moved out of the house, they left within days of discovering the basement room, of course. A detective named Marcus Webb, who had been lead investigator on the Pruitt case, received a phone call at his office. There was silence on the other end. Then slow, steady breathing. Then a voice, low, calm, almost amused, said 4 words. "I counted you too." The call was traced to a payphone outside a gas station in rural Colorado. By the time officers arrived, there was no one there. Gerald Pruitt was placed on a federal watch list. He has never been found. The house on Elm Drive was demolished in 2009 after a fire of undetermined origin. And Lily Ramirez, who is now in her late 20s, has never spoken publicly about what she saw in that house. She has, however, confirmed one thing in a brief interview she gave to a local journalist in 2018. She said the man she saw in her room, the one she called the man from the basement, never touched her. He just stood in the doorway and watched. He had, she said, the kindest smile I've ever seen on anyone. She said that was the worst part. Story 2. The Sleepwalker. Most of us sleepwalk occasionally. A few steps out of bed, maybe to the bathroom, maybe to the kitchen. It's unsettling, sure. But it's human. It's documented. It's explainable. What happened to Anna Creighton was not explainable. Anna was 26 years old when it started, living alone in a ground-floor flat in Edinburgh. She was a graduate student studying medieval history at the University of Edinburgh. Known by her friends as brilliant, grounded, and deeply skeptical of anything she couldn't find a rational explanation for. She first noticed something was wrong when she woke up one October morning to find mud on the bottoms of her feet. Her flat was clean. Her floors were clean. She had no houseplants, no pets, no reason for there to be soil anywhere in her home. She chalked it up to sleepwalking. She'd done it as a child. Her mother had told her. She bought a chain lock for her front door, the kind you can't open from the inside without being fully awake. And she thought that would be the end of it. The next morning, she woke up with the chain lock hanging open and mud on her feet again, and scratches on her arms. Not deep scratches, not the kind that suggested self-harm. These were thin, superficial, like she had pushed through dense undergrowth in the dark. Like she had walked through brambles. She went to her doctor. She was referred to a sleep clinic. She was diagnosed with a severe form of non-REM parasomnia, a sleep disorder in which a person can engage in complex behaviors, including walking, driving, and even cooking, while fully unconscious and with no memory of these activities upon waking. The clinic fitted her with a monitoring device, a small sensor worn on the wrist that would record movement and heart rate throughout the night. They also set up a camera in her bedroom. What the camera recorded on the 3rd night of monitoring changed the approach of everyone involved. At 2:14 in the morning, the footage showed Anna sitting up in bed. Her eyes were open, blank, unfocused, the flat gaze of deep sleep. She stood. She walked to the window. She unlatched it, raised it, and climbed out into the garden of the flat. The camera in her room lost her at that point, but she had given her neighbor, a retired schoolteacher named Isabel, a spare key for emergencies. Isabel, who had a habit of late-night reading, happened to glance out her own window at approximately 2:20 that morning. She later told investigators what she saw. Anna was standing in the garden, perfectly still. In her nightgown, her feet were bare. She was facing the back fence, which bordered a small strip of wild woodland, and she was speaking, not muttering, not the fragmented speech of a dream. She was speaking clearly, in full sentences, in a low voice. Isabel couldn't make out the words, but she could see that Anna's face was turned upwards slightly, as if she were looking at something taller than herself, as if she were speaking to someone standing in front of her. Isabel saw no one else in the garden. She called out to Anna. Anna turned, walked back to her window, climbed inside, lay down, and appeared to go back to sleep. The entire episode lasted 11 minutes. When Anna reviewed the footage the following morning, she had no memory of any of it. She was calm, analytical, determined to find a rational explanation. But when investigators from the sleep clinic enhanced the audio from the garden footage, Isabel had had the presence of mind to record on her phone from her window. They found something that shifted the nature of the investigation. On the recording, Anna's voice was clear enough to transcribe. She was speaking in full, coherent sentences, but the content of what she was saying made no sense. She was giving directions, specific, detailed directions, street names, distances, landmarks, and a name. The name she repeated several times throughout the 11-minute recording was Helen. Police, who had been kept informed of the case due to the increasing concern of the sleep clinic, ran the name and the street address against their records. Helen Marsh, 43 years old, reported missing from an address matching one of the locations Anna had described. An address Anna had no known connection to, had never visited, and had never mentioned to anyone. Helen Marsh had been missing for 9 days. Officers followed the directions Anna had given in her sleep almost exactly. The route led through the woodland behind her flat, across a field, and to an abandoned farm building approximately 2 miles away. Helen Marsh was found there, alive but barely. She had fallen into an old cellar and broken her leg. She had been there for 9 days, surviving on rainwater. How Anna Creighton knew where Helen Marsh was, how she could have had any information about a missing person she had no connection to, has never been explained. Anna herself was deeply shaken. She told investigators she had no dream she could recall, no voice, no vision, no sense of anything unusual, just sleep and then morning. She moved out of her flat within the month. She finished her degree and went on to become a lecturer. She has spoken about the incident only once, in a written account she provided to a paranormal research organization, which she submitted anonymously. In it, she wrote, "I don't believe in ghosts. I don't believe in the supernatural. I believe in evidence. But I also believe that whatever happened to me that night operated by rules I don't have the vocabulary to describe. And that frightens me more than any ghost story ever could." Helen Marsh, meanwhile, recovered fully from her injuries. She and Anna have never met. Story 3. The photographer. Raymond Fisk was a nature photographer, a good one. Not famous, but respected in the small, dedicated community of people who spend their lives chasing light in wild places. He had sold images to nature magazines, had a modest following, and had spent 30 years hiking trails across the Pacific Northwest with a camera around his neck. In September of 1998, He drove alone into the Siuslaw National Forest in coastal Oregon. He had done this dozens of times. He was experienced, well-equipped, and careful. He filed a trip plan with a friend, telling her he planned to spend 4 days in the backcountry, photographing the autumn transition of the forest. On day 3, something found him. He returned from that trip on schedule, which is what made what came next so confusing for everyone who knew him. He drove home, unloaded his gear, and called his friend to tell her he was back safe. He sounded, she said, perfectly normal, maybe a little quiet. It was only when he developed the photographs that everything changed. Raymond was not a digital photographer. He shot on film, 35mm medium format, the kind of photography that requires patience and commitment. He had used 3 rolls of film on this trip, 108 exposures. When he spread the prints across his work table, his hands started shaking. The first 63 photographs were what he expected. Beautiful, considered images of the forest in early autumn. Mist rising off the creek, old-growth firs wrapped in fog, a deer at the edge of a meadow. The compositions were careful, the exposure was excellent. Everything was normal. Photographs 64 through 108 were not. Raymond had no memory of taking them. They were not nature photographs. They were photographs of him, taken from behind, from a distance, sometimes 50 yards, sometimes what appeared to be much farther, but always clear, always focused, as if whoever was holding the camera had access to the same high-quality telephoto lens Raymond used himself. In 37 of the 45 photographs, Raymond was going about normal camp activities, cooking over his small camp stove, reading by headlamp in his tent, washing his face in the creek, unaware. In the final 8 photographs, he was asleep. The camera had been placed, not held. The framing was too steady for a handheld shot. Had been placed approximately 4 feet from the entrance of his tent, aimed inside. Raymond was visible in his sleeping bag, face slack, deeply asleep, and in the last photograph, the very last frame on the final roll, something was different. Raymond was still asleep, but the camera angle had changed slightly. It was lower now, closer to the ground, as if whoever had been holding it or placing it had crouched down, and in the lower right corner of the frame, barely visible in the darkness, there was a hand, not Raymond's hand. His arms were inside the sleeping bag, a hand, long fingers, pale, resting on the ground just inside the entrance of the tent, as if someone had reached in. Raymond Fisk filed a report with the local sheriff's office. Rangers searched the area of his campsite. They found evidence of someone having been in the area. A cleared space behind a fallen log where a person could have crouched with a clear line of sight to the camp. Some disturbance in the undergrowth, but no one was ever identified. What has continued to disturb investigators and the people who have studied this case over the years is one specific detail. The photographs of Raymond Fisk were taken using his own camera. The camera that had been around his neck. The camera that he had set down. Only once, he insisted, only for a few minutes to wash in the creek, and then picked back up again. He had no memory of the camera ever leaving his possession for more than those few minutes. He had no memory of handing it to anyone. He had no memory of anyone being near his camp at all. But someone had been there. Someone who knew how to use his camera. Someone who had been patient enough, skilled enough, and brave enough to enter his tent while he slept. Raymond Fisk retired from backcountry photography after that trip. He moved to the city. He has not returned to the Siuslaw National Forest. The photographs were studied by a forensic photo analyst who confirmed they were unaltered, no darkroom manipulation, no digital editing. They were taken on the original rolls of film that had been in Raymond's camera throughout the trip. The person in those photographs was never identified. The hand in the last frame was never identified. Raymond still has the prints. He keeps them in a box in a storage unit across town. He says he has not looked at them in 20 years. I don't need to, he told the one journalist who ever interviewed him about the incident. They're already the first thing I see every time I close my eyes. Story 4. The Neighbor. Diane Kowalski was 51 years old and had lived in her Chicago apartment for 11 years when the new tenant moved in next door. She didn't think much of him at first. He was quiet, which she appreciated. The previous tenant had kept late hours and played music too loud. The new one was almost invisible. She heard him come in late at night, heard the soft click of his deadbolt, and that was all. She never heard music, never heard a television, never heard him on the phone. She saw him once in the hallway in the first week. He was tall, thin, somewhere in his 40s. He had very light eyes, gray or pale blue. She couldn't be sure. He nodded at her but didn't speak. She nodded back and went into her apartment. The building super, a friendly man named Phil, told her the new tenant's name was Richard Hale. He'd paid 6 months' rent up front in cash. He had no references, but Phil had assumed that meant he was coming out of a difficult situation. A divorce, maybe, or a job loss. He'd seemed polite enough. Diane thought nothing of it. Then the notes started. The first one appeared under her door on a Wednesday morning in March, about 2 weeks after Hale had moved in. It was written on plain white paper in very neat, very small handwriting. It said, "Please keep your curtains closed at night, for your own good." Diane read it twice. She was unsettled, but she told herself it was a strange but perhaps well-meaning warning. Maybe there had been break-ins in the area. Maybe he'd seen something she hadn't. She mentioned it to Phil, who shrugged and said he'd talk to the guy. She didn't close her curtains. She lived on the 4th floor. She had always felt safe. A week later, the second note appeared. "I can see what watches you. You cannot. Please close the curtains." Now she was genuinely disturbed. She went to Phil, who knocked on Richard Hale's door. There was no answer. Phil slid a note under the door asking Hale to contact him about the situation. Hale never responded. Diane called the non-emergency police line. An officer came, took her statement, noted the address. He was kind but told her that odd notes from a neighbor, while unsettling, didn't constitute a crime. He suggested she consider them a wellness concern about the neighbor himself, that perhaps the man had mental health challenges, and advised her to let him know if the notes escalated. 3 days later, the third note. This one was different, longer, written on both sides of the paper in the same small, precise hand. It read, "I know you think I'm disturbed. I understand, but I have been watching your window from my apartment for 2 weeks, and there is something that also watches your window, comes after midnight, stands at street level, and it looks up. I don't know what it is. I've tried to photograph it. The photographs don't develop correctly. There's only darkness where it stands. Last night it was there for 4 hours. It does not move, simply watches. I don't know if it can come inside. I don't know what it wants. But I believe you should know." Diane read that letter many times. She told herself it was the writing of a paranoid, delusional man. She told herself he needed help. She felt sympathy and fear in equal measure. But that night, at 1 a.m, she found herself standing at the edge of her window, peering down at the street. She later described what she saw in a written account she provided to a journalist investigating a series of unusual reports from that neighborhood. She said she saw a figure on the street below, standing on the pavement across from the building, perfectly still. She couldn't make out its face or its features. It was dark, and the nearest streetlight was half a block away, but she could see its shape, and it was looking up. She said that she stood there for perhaps 30 seconds, and that the figure did not move at all during that time. Then she dropped her curtain and stepped back from the window. She called the police. By the time officers arrived and checked the street, there was nothing there. 2 days later, Richard Hale was gone. He had cleared out his apartment, taking everything. Sometime in the night, Phil found the key on the kitchen counter and the apartment completely empty. No forwarding address, no notice. The name Richard Hale produced no matching records in any database the police checked. Diane moved out of her apartment 6 weeks later. She said she continued to see the figure on the street below her window on several nights after Hale had gone. Always after midnight, always still, always looking up. She said she eventually began closing her curtains. Not because I was afraid of it, she wrote in her account, but because I had started to feel that it could tell, somehow, whether I was watching it back, and I didn't want it to know I was there. The figure was never identified. Diane has never found out who Richard Hale was, where he came from, or where he went. She has also never found out what he saw in those photographs that didn't develop correctly. Story 6. What the cameras saw. I'm going to tell you this story exactly as it was shared with me by someone who worked in the facility in question. The name of the facility has been withheld at the request of this person, who still works in the security industry and fears professional repercussions for speaking about what happened. What I can tell you is that this facility was a large residential care home, a nursing home, in the northeastern United States. It had approximately 140 residents, a full staff of nurses and aides, and a comprehensive CCTV system covering all hallways, common areas, and exterior spaces. My source, I'll call him Marcus, was a night shift security officer who worked the overnight, reviewing camera feeds and doing hourly perimeter checks. He had worked in the facility for 3 years without incident. In January of 2014, during a period of particularly cold weather, he began to notice something on the overnight camera feeds, in the long, quiet hallways of the residential wings. He kept seeing something that shouldn't have been there, a figure, not a staff member. Marcus knew all the night staff, and this figure wore no uniform and appeared on no schedule, not a resident. The figure moved quickly, purposefully, and disappeared around corners in a way that would have been impossible for most of the residents, many of whom used walkers or wheelchairs. The figure appeared only between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning. It appeared in different wings on different nights, and it always seemed to stop, just for a moment, outside the doors of specific rooms. Marcus didn't report it immediately. He assumed it was a glitch, a reflection, some artifact of the camera system. He checked the cameras, which were functioning normally. He reviewed the footage carefully. The figure was there. It was not a glitch. He started writing down the room numbers. Room 114, Room 208, Room 331, Room 107. He wrote them down not because he expected anything, but because something made him want to keep track. After 2 weeks, he reviewed his list. Then he quietly checked the facility's records, which, as a security officer, he had access to. Every room on his list had experienced a death within 48 hours of the figure appearing outside its door. Not one exception. Every single room. Marcus went to his supervisor, a no-nonsense woman who had managed the facility for 15 years. She reviewed the footage. She was quiet for a long time. Then she told Marcus she was going to have the camera system checked by a technician, and that he should continue his normal duties. The technician found nothing wrong with the system. The figure continued to appear. Marcus continued to log the rooms. The deaths continued to follow. What Marcus found most disturbing, what he said has never fully left him, was something he noticed when he spent time carefully reviewing the footage frame by frame. The figure always stopped outside the room's door, sometimes for 30 seconds, sometimes for several minutes, and then it always did the same thing before moving on. It reached out and placed its hand flat against the door, just for a moment, gently, like someone saying good night. Marcus left his job at the facility in April of 2014. He said he left because the work had become too heavy for him. He said that every time he saw the figure stop outside a door, he knew what it meant, and having that knowledge and being able to do nothing had broken something in him. He told me that in the 3 months he kept his records, he logged 22 rooms. 22 deaths followed. He said he never found out what the figure was. He said he asked once a very elderly nurse who had worked in care for 40 years whether she had ever heard of such things. She didn't seem surprised by the question at all. She told him that, in her experience, the dying always knew that before a death, there was a change in a room, a quietness, a temperature, a shift in the air that experienced staff learned to recognize. She said she didn't know what came for people at the end, but she had never believed it was nothing. Whatever it is, she told him, it's gentle. I've never seen anyone afraid of it. I've seen them reach out sometimes, their hands, even when they can barely move, reaching. Whatever it is, she said. They know it. They recognize it. That should comfort you, she said. Marcus told me it didn't. Story 7. The Letter. Michael Strand was a high school history teacher, 44 years old, divorced, living alone in a house in a quiet neighborhood of Minneapolis. He was by his own description an orderly, methodical person, the kind of man who kept his house neat, his car maintained, his bills paid on time. He was also, and this is important, the kind of person who kept records. He wrote things down. He had done so since he was a teenager. Not a journal exactly, more of a log. Dates, events, observations. He had dozens of these notebooks going back to his college years. In February of 2016, he received a letter in the mail. The envelope had no return address. His name and address were written on the front in a handwriting he didn't recognize. Careful, old-fashioned, the kind of penmanship that suggested someone who had learned to write with a fountain pen. Inside was a single sheet of paper. On it was written, Michael, you will not remember me, but I was present on 4 occasions in your life. I watched you without your knowledge each time. The first was the summer you turned 8, at the lake where your family vacationed. You fell into the water. I was on the dock. You came back up before I needed to help. The second was when you were 16, the night of the accident on Route 9. You walked away. I was in the car behind yours. The third was 7 years ago, the night you stayed late at school grading papers and walked to your car alone at 11 o'clock. The man who had been watching you from the parking lot left when he saw me nearby. The fourth was last week, on Tuesday. You were unwell. You were alone. I was outside your window. You are better now. I will not contact you again. I have completed my watch. Be well. Michael read the letter a dozen times. He was methodical. He was a historian by temperament. He did not panic. He went to his notebooks. He found the entry from the summer he turned 8. The family vacation at the lake. His entry, written in a child's handwriting, read, Fell off dock. Mom cried. I was okay. He found the entry from when he was 16. Accident on Route 9 tonight. James's car hit the guardrail. Nobody hurt bad. Walked home. Strange night. He found an entry from 7 years prior, February 2009. Worked late tonight. Walked to car. Felt like someone was watching me. Nothing there. Probably tired. He found an entry from the Tuesday of the previous week. Not feeling well. Stayed in. Slept most of the day. Every event mentioned in the letter was in his notebooks. Events that had happened over a span of 36 years. Michael went to the police. They took his statement, examined the letter. The handwriting could not be matched to any database. The paper was standard stock, available anywhere. There were no fingerprints on the letter or envelope other than Michael's. They asked Michael if he had any enemies, anyone who might know his history well enough to reference those specific events. He could think of no one. They asked whether the events described could have been invented, whether someone could have made educated guesses based on Michael's known history. Michael pointed out that no one else knew about the incident on Route 9. It had never been reported in any paper. The accident had been minor. He had never spoken about it to anyone in his adult life. It was in his notebook and nowhere else. The investigation was inconclusive. Michael has kept the letter. He keeps it alongside his notebooks, which he has continued to maintain. He told a colleague about the experience a year later, and that colleague eventually shared the story with Michael's reluctant permission. At a gathering of people who collect accounts of unexplained events, what Michael finds most difficult to reconcile, he said, is not the idea that someone watched him. It is the tone of the letter. It didn't feel threatening, he said. It felt like a farewell, like someone saying goodbye, like someone who had been assigned a task and had now completed it. He paused. Which raises the question, he said, who gives those assignments? And to whom? He has not received another letter. He said sometimes he wishes he would. Story 8. The Cabin in the Hills. This is a story about being hunted. Not metaphorically, not in a way that requires any interpretation. Todd and Karen Emery were in the wilderness of northern Idaho in October of 2009, and something or someone spent 3 days trying to find them. They were an experienced outdoors couple, both in their early 40s. Todd had spent summers as a wilderness guide in his 20s. Karen was an avid hiker and had completed multiple backcountry expeditions. They were not naive. They were not unprepared. They were exactly the kind of people you'd want with you in an emergency. They were not prepared for what happened. They had hiked into the backcountry on a Thursday in early October, planning a 5-day loop. Their first 2 days went without incident. Beautiful, quiet, the wilderness at its most generous. On Friday evening, they made camp at a designated site near a ridgeline and cooked dinner as the sun went down over the mountains. That night, sometime after midnight, Todd woke up. He described it as a feeling rather than a sound, a sense that something had changed in the air around the tent. He lay still and listened. He heard nothing unusual, but the feeling persisted. He unzipped the tent and looked out. In the tree line at the edge of the clearing, perhaps 60 feet away, he saw a light, not a beam, not a flashlight, a small, diffuse glow, like someone holding a lighter at arm's length or cupping a small flame. He watched it for 30 seconds. It didn't move. Then it went out. He told himself it was a hiker, another camper. He went back to sleep. In the morning, he walked to the tree line and looked for evidence of another camp. He found footprints, one set, leading toward the clearing from deeper in the forest. They stopped at the edge of the trees. There was a cleared space where someone had stood for some time. The undergrowth was compressed, the soil disturbed, and then the footprints turned and went back into the forest. Just stood there and watched their tent. Todd told Karen. They discussed leaving. They decided to move on, to push further along the trail and put distance between themselves and whoever had been watching their camp. That afternoon, descending a ridge, Karen stopped. There was someone on the trail below them, distant, maybe 400 yards, but visible, the figure, standing still, looking up toward them, male by appearance, dressed in dark clothing. Todd called out, a greeting, the standard backcountry courtesy. Hello down there. The figure did not respond. It turned and walked off the trail, into the dense brush on the western side, and disappeared. They didn't sleep well that night. They had made camp in a more sheltered spot with better sight lines. Todd kept watch in 2-hour shifts. Nothing came. On the third day, they found the shelter, off the trail about 200 yards into the forest, largely invisible unless you were looking for it. A crude structure, branches and tarps, a fire ring with recent ash, a folding cot, empty food cans, the remnants of several days of occupation, and on a flat rock near the fire ring, arranged carefully, 2 items, a photograph and a knife. The photograph was of Todd and Karen, taken from behind at some distance with a telephoto lens. They were in their camp. From the angle and their clothing, it had been taken the previous morning, while they were eating breakfast. The knife was Karen's, a small folding knife she carried in an exterior pocket of her pack. She hadn't noticed it was missing. They left the backcountry immediately. They were miles from the nearest trailhead, and they moved as fast as they safely could. They heard nothing behind them, saw no one, but Todd said later that the silence itself had felt different, watchful. They reported the incident to the sheriff's office when they reached their car. Officers searched the area of the shelter and found it abandoned. Whoever had been there had cleared out. The photograph was processed for fingerprints. None usable were found. The knife was kept as evidence. No one was ever identified. No arrest was ever made. What has stayed with both Todd and Karen, what they have described in the various accounts they have given since, is the knife, the specific fact of the knife, because it meant that someone had come close enough to Karen to remove a knife from her pack without her feeling it. In the daylight, while she was awake and moving, someone that skilled, someone that practiced, someone, Karen said, that she would not have heard coming. The photograph scared me, she told one interviewer, but the knife made me understand something. We had never been safe, not for a minute of those 3 days, whatever it was that person wanted. They could have taken it any time they chose. The fact that they didn't, she said, might be the most frightening part, or it might be the only reason we're alive. Story 9. The Girl Who Came Back. I want to be clear before I tell you this story. I am not making claims about the supernatural. I am telling you what was reported, what was witnessed, what was documented. What you conclude is your own business. The Vance family lived in a small house in rural Georgia. Mother, father, 3 children. Ordinary people. Church-going, their neighbors said. Quiet, decent. Their youngest daughter, Emma, was 7 years old when she disappeared in the summer of 1997. She went out to play in the field behind the house one morning and didn't come back for lunch. They searched. The community searched. The police searched. Emma was not found. 2 years passed. The family grieved. The case went cold. The parents, by all accounts, barely functioned. Their other children. A boy of 10 and a girl of 14 when Emma disappeared. Grew up in the shadow of an absence that no one talked about because no one knew what to say. In September of 1999, Emma came home. The older daughter, now 16, was alone in the house when she heard a knock at the back door. She opened it. Emma was standing on the back porch. She was not visibly injured. She was thin, and her clothes were different. A plain dress, not something her family recognized. She looked, by her sister's account, almost exactly as she had 2 years before. A little taller, perhaps, but unmistakably Emma, her sister, after a moment of paralysis, grabbed her and pulled her inside and called her parents. Emma spoke. She knew her family's names. She knew the names of the family's dog, who had since died. She knew her bedroom, her things, the layout of the house. She knew things that only Emma could have known. The parents were overwhelmed. They called law enforcement, who came and confirmed, as thoroughly as they could in those first hours, that this appeared to be Emma Vance. A doctor examined Emma. She was malnourished, but not critically so. She had no significant injuries. Her development was slightly delayed for a 9-year-old, consistent with 2 years of poor nutrition and limited stimulation. There was no evidence of acute abuse. DNA testing, conducted over the following weeks, confirmed that Emma was biologically who she appeared to be. Emma could not, or would not, say where she had been, not evasively, not defiantly. When asked, she simply looked confused, as if the question didn't fully make sense to her. She knew she had been away. She knew she had come home. The space in between was, in her words, just quiet. Just quiet, she said. Every time they asked, investigators worked the case intensively for months. They found no physical evidence of where Emma had been kept. No location, no perpetrator, no witnesses who could account for her whereabouts during those 2 years. She appeared to have emerged from nowhere. One of the detectives involved in the case, now retired, spoke anonymously to a researcher years later and said that in 30 years of law enforcement, Emma Vance's return was the only case that had genuinely frightened him, not because of what Emma said, because of what she didn't say. He said that in his years working with abducted children, they always knew things, locations, descriptions, names, even when traumatized, even when silent. Under careful questioning, in time, information emerged. Always, with Emma, nothing emerged, not because she was resistant, but because there appeared to be nothing there. No location she could describe, no person she could name, no smell, no sound, no specific memory of any moment during those 2 years. Like she'd been somewhere, he said, where nothing happened. And when I say nothing, he said, I don't mean nothing bad. I mean nothing. Full stop. Emma Vance grew up, graduated high school, went to college, built a life. By all accounts, she is a functional, reasonably happy adult. She has given exactly one interview about her experience, a brief written statement provided to a journalist in 2008, when she was an adult. In it, she confirmed only this, that she knew she had been away, that she did not remember being afraid, that she had not been alone during that time, though she could not describe any companion, and that the reason she could not remember more was not that her memory had been damaged. It was, she said, that there was nothing to remember. Where she had been did not produce memories. It wasn't darkness, she said. It wasn't nothing exactly. It was more like the time between sleeping and waking, where you know you existed, but nothing was recorded. She said she did not find it frightening to think about. Whatever it was, she said. It wasn't cruel. Came back. Some people don't. She declined all further interview requests. Story 10. The Last Patient. I want to end tonight with the story that I find most difficult, not because it's the most violent, not because it's the most sensational, but because it was told to me by someone who tells it as simply and matter-of-factly as anyone I have ever spoken to about the experiences of their life. And the simplicity of it, somehow, makes it the most disturbing of all. Dr. Sarah Okonkwo is a palliative care physician. She has spent 20 years working with patients who are dying, providing comfort, managing pain, guiding families through the hardest transitions a human being can face. She is calm, precise, and deeply compassionate. She is not a person given to dramatics. She told me this story over tea at a cafe in London, in the same tone she might use to describe a difficult consultation or an interesting case. She said it had happened 3 times across her career, always the same, with slight variations but always in its essential shape the same. The first time, she was a junior doctor in her late 20s. She was attending to a man in his 80s, a former architect named Bernard, who was in the final days of a long illness. He had been in and out of consciousness for 48 hours. His family had been notified. Everyone was waiting. Sarah was sitting with him in the early morning hours, monitoring his condition. He was unconscious, had been for most of the previous day, and then, at approximately 4 in the morning, he opened his eyes, not the dull, unfocused gaze of someone barely conscious. He opened his eyes fully, clearly, with a quality of alertness that Sarah said was startling after so many hours of unconsciousness. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then he turned his head and looked directly at Sarah, and then he looked past her, to the left, at the empty chair beside the bed. He smiled, not a small smile, a full, warm, delighted smile. The kind of smile, Sarah said, you give to someone you love whom you haven't seen in a very long time. He raised his hand slightly, barely, just a tremor of movement, in the direction of the empty chair. Then he died. Sarah described this as moving but not strange. She had heard of such things. Terminal lucidity. The dying often seemed to see or sense something in their final moments. She filed it in her mind as a profound but explicable feature of the dying process. The second time happened 7 years later. A woman in her 70s. Same story, essentially. The sudden lucidity, the looking past Sarah, the smile, the gesture toward something in the room that Sarah could not see. This time, though, the woman spoke. Just 2 words, clear, spoken to the empty space beside her bed. I know, she said, and then she died. Sarah thought about those 2 words for a long time, what they might mean, what question might have been answered in those final seconds. The third time was different. This time, Sarah was the last person in the room with a man named Thomas, 61 years old, dying of cancer, whose family had stepped out briefly to get coffee. Sarah was checking his vitals. He was unconscious. Then he wasn't. He opened his eyes. He looked at the ceiling. He turned his head. Not toward the empty chair this time. Toward Sarah. He looked directly at her, clearly, fully awake, by every appearance. In his final minutes of life, he said, "She says to tell you that she's glad you were here." Then his eyes closed. He died 3 minutes later. Sarah said she sat with that for a very long time after. She, a woman, someone in the room with them, someone Thomas could apparently see and hear and relay a message from, a message directed at Sarah herself. She asked herself whether it could have been directed at someone else, at a family member, at a nurse who had just left the room. She examined every possibility. They had been alone. The message was for her, from someone she couldn't see. I asked Sarah how she felt about that. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I felt grateful," which surprised me, but it felt like something from the other side of a door. A message passed under it, and the message was kind. She paused. "I've been in that room with dying people 1,000 times," she said. "If there's something on the other side of what we call death, if these patients are seeing something real in their final moments, then whatever it isn't frightening them. They're glad to see it." She looked at her tea. "That's not nothing," she said. "That's not nothing at all." 10 stories. A man who watched. A woman who walked in her sleep to save a stranger. A photographer whose camera was stolen in the night. A neighbor who warned a woman about something she couldn't see. A voice in the walls that knew the future. A figure that walked the halls of a nursing home ahead of death. A letter from someone who had always been there. Couple hunted through the wilderness. A girl who came back from nowhere. And a message passed under a door from the other side. These things happened. They were documented. They were witnessed. They were never fully explained. That's the thing about real horror. It doesn't resolve. It doesn't tie up neatly at the end. It sits with you, follows you home. It stays in the corner of the room while you're trying to fall asleep, and it makes you wonder. Not about monsters, not really, but about the edges of what you understand, about the places where the map runs out, about what stands just outside the light. I'm gonna leave you with one final thought. Raymond Fisk, the photographer from Story 3, when asked whether he was afraid that whoever had been in his camp was still out there, somewhere still watching, he thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "Aren't they always? Sleep well."